Good morning, everyone. Before we go to this morning's topic, I'd like to just introduce another variation of Shamatha practice. So a few days ago we did the Shamatha practice, observing the mind. In other words, observing our thoughts, emotions and so forth. And many of you probably found that quite challenging because we have the habit of following our thoughts, so we just get swept away all the time. And then the following day we introduced the practice of simply resting in awareness, knowing that we're aware. And so what I'd like to do now is combine those two practices into a practice that's sometimes called stillness in motion. And that is, we're going to start by just resting in awareness, knowing that we're aware, resting in that open, spacious stillness. And then from that basis, then a little bit later in the meditation, we're going to start to observe the thoughts and emotions and so forth. And you may find that because we're having that as a basis, we're a little bit anchored in that. And you may find that you don't get swept away as much. So that resting in awareness can really provide us a little bit of an anchor for that practice of observing the mind, observing the thoughts and emotions. And so that's what we're going to do now. We'll do that practice and we'll see if that helps, that resting in awareness, if that helps to anchor ourselves in that practice. So again, 15-minute practice. So as always, we begin by preparing the body. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. In this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And preparing the mind, simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment, and simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Noticing if it's slow or fast, deep or shallow, long or short. without trying to modify it in any way. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed, and then simply release all appearances, allowing the mind to come to rest, not doing anything at all. Simply being present, knowing that you're aware. And simply rest in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. And now, whilst resting in that stillness, start to observe any movements of the mind. Observing any thoughts, emotions, or other mental events as they arise and pass. finding that you're getting caught up in your thoughts, then place more emphasis on stillness. That is, mainly focus on stillness of awareness. And just a little bit in the corner of your mind, notice any thoughts. And if you find yourself simply falling into dullness or drowsiness, then place more emphasis on the movements. That is, pay closer attention to the thoughts and less to stillness. And if you're completely lost in this practice, go back into the body and focus on the rhythm of the breath. Have that as your main object. And just a little bit in the corner of your mind, notice any thoughts. will practice that a few more times with Felipe today and tomorrow. So before we go to today's topics, let's just do a little short review. So we've been using, as the framework for all of our discussions, the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, of course, is the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And we saw in the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha's diagnosis for us was that we're stuck in this state of dukkha. And the reason we're stuck in this unsatisfactory state, where there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life, is because we have a contaminated mind. Our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. And so if we can come to realize this, to realize as well that we can eliminate these mental afflictions in our mind, then we can develop the aspiration to be liberated from suffering. So remember, that was renunciation. And that if we want to strive for the goal of liberation, we need to gain insight into the nature of reality. And here in the Four Noble Truths teachings, then we had those three insights of impermanent, suffering, no self. And at the deepest level, it's this wisdom of no self that enables us to overcome all mental afflictions and suffering. So if we cultivate this aspiration for liberation, and then we engage in the Vipassana practice of no self, then we can achieve that goal of liberation called nirvana. And then we saw in that, in the perfection of wisdom teachings of the Buddha, that there was identified a further goal of enlightenment that we can achieve. And that to strive for that goal, of course, we need to develop this aspiration of bodhicitta. And that if we aspire to that goal of enlightenment, this bodhicitta, then of course we also need to engage in Vipassana practice to eliminate distorted view of reality. And here it's identified the practice that is really, at the deepest level, is this wisdom of emptiness. And if we engage in this Vipassana practice of emptiness on the basis of this bodhicitta motivation, we can achieve enlightenment. And then we also saw briefly what was called the Vajrayana or Tantra vehicle. That also in Tantra or Vajrayana, we cultivate the aspiration of bodhicitta. We have the realization of emptiness, and we have the same goal of enlightenment. But of course there we're trying to access a deeper level of mind, this very subtle mind. So what we can see here is there are levels of practice. And in Tibetan Buddhism, all of these levels are present. And so all these various practices are packaged in a certain way to show to us how to systematically go through these levels of practice. And in the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, the packaging is called Dzogchen. In the Kagyu school, it's called Mahamudra. In the Sakya school, it's called Lamdre. And in the Geluk school, which this centre is part of, is called LAMRIM. So what I'd like to do this morning is have a look at this LAMRIM packaging. How does the Geluk school package all of these practices in a very systematic, step-by-step way? So let's have a look at that. Sorry?
How do you spell it?
Yeah, I'm going to write it on the board. So LAMRIM is a Tibetan word. Lam means path, Rim means stages. So LAMRIM is stages of the path to enlightenment. And this is the way all of these practices are packaged in the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. And this system of practice was brought into Tibet by great Indian master Lama Atisha in the 11th century. In fact, this statue at the end of the altar here with the red hat, that is Lama Atisha. And in the LAMRIM system, the very first topic we see is relying on a teacher, which seems to indicate then the very first thing we need to do is find a teacher. And of course, at the time these texts were written, that was probably true. Because in ancient India and Tibet, I guess most people were illiterate, and so there were hardly any texts available anyway. And so the only way we would find out anything about a spiritual path is if a teacher happened to visit our village that we lived in. So without that, there would be really no possibility to begin anything. Because there's hardly any texts, and even if there were, most people wouldn't be able to read them. But of course, in the modern world, things are a little bit different. You know, we have access to a lot of books and teachings and so forth. So of course in the modern world we can begin to do something without a personal teacher. But of course there are many advantages to having a personal teacher. Because a personal teacher can give us very personal advice, can really tailor the practices according to our needs. So they can help us to save a lot of time. Because otherwise we may do practices that are not really suitable for us and not most effective for us. So they can help save a lot of time. And also, of course, a personal teacher can help correct any mistakes. Because sometimes we try to do practices, but we don't realise how to do them, and we end up doing them in an incorrect way and don't get the benefit because of that. And then also, what you often find is that we try to do these practices and we come up against a lot of obstacles, either internal or external obstacles. And often it's not obvious how to overcome these obstacles and we get stuck. But if we have a personal teacher, they can help us to overcome obstacles. And very often they can actually turn these obstacles into things that can actually help us in the practice. But to do that on our own is not easy. And then also, traditionally how this would work would be the teacher would give us some instruction. We'd go off and implement that instruction for some time, maybe some weeks or months. We'd come back and report what had happened, and then based on what we reported, they would adjust our practice. So there would be this constant feedback loop, which of course without a teacher doesn't exist. And then of course another thing that can be is extremely helpful to having a personal teacher is that we can receive a lot of inspiration from them. We need inspiration in practice. Without a personal teacher, that's much more difficult to gain, this inspiration to do the practice. Now, the teacher is sometimes called the outer guru, and the job of the outer guru is to awaken the inner guru within ourselves. So actually, long term, the teacher is trying to make themselves out of a job so that we can rely more and more on our own inner wisdom. Now our inner wisdom is very much obscured by mental afflictions and so forth, so we need a lot of external help to develop that. But as we develop it, then we can become more and more self-reliant. Now, is it okay to have more than one personal teacher? Of course, we can go to a number of different teachers just to get general instructions. But when it comes to personal advice, it's very much recommended just to have one personal teacher. Because if you have more than one personal teacher, what can often happen is that we go to a teacher for some personal advice, and very often the case is they will give us the one thing to do, the one thing that we don't want to do, because it's the one thing we really need to work on. And so when we hear that, we go, oh, I don't like the sound of that. And then we run off to another teacher for asking for advice. And they probably give us the same advice. And we'll keep running around until we get to a teacher that says something nice to us. And that's not in our best interest. And also, of course, if we have more than one personal teacher, and we get advice from two different teachers, and those advice seems to be contradictory, what do? We get confused. We don't know what to do. And generally, if you get personal instructions from a teacher, and you go to another teacher, and they ask you, do you have already got some personal advice? And if you say yes, I'll say, implement that. Don't ask me for advice, implement what your teacher told you. And how to relate to the teacher is, a good analogy is the analogy of a fire. If we're too far from a fire, we don't receive any warmth. If we're too close to the fire, we get burnt. So similarly, if we're too far from the teacher, we don't receive warmth, and in terms of personal guidance and inspiration. If we're too close to the teacher, we can get burnt. And we can get burnt in two ways at least. One is that if the teacher is always there and readily available, we can fall into this trap of absolving personal responsibility. Anytime there's a question, we simply run to the teacher and say, what shall we do? That is not in our best interest. And actually, if we have a qualified teacher and he or she sees that we're doing that and come with a very, very trivial question, they often get very harsh to us and say, go away and sort that out yourself. Because it's not in our best interest if we go, every time we have a question, we run off to the teacher, because then we're not becoming self-reliant. And then also, if we're too close to the teacher, then what often can happen is we start projecting faults onto the teacher when actually there are none there. So therefore, we need to have that good distance from the teacher. Not too far so we don't receive guidance and inspiration, but not too close so we don't get burned. Which means, particularly in the modern world, we don't even need to be living in the same town as our teacher. But we would need to gain some access to them a number of times a year. So if they are coming to where we live a couple of times a year, or we can travel to them a couple of times a year, that might be enough. And in between, if we have any questions, then of course these days we have email. We send an email and say, I've got this difficulty, what should I do? And often we hear this expression that when you're ready, the teacher will appear. And then we have this idea we'll be lying at home on the couch, sipping our coffee. There'll be a knock on the door. We'll open it up and there'll be a person with a big halo around their head saying, "I'm here to help you." I think that's not going to happen. If we really want to find a teacher, we need to do at least two things. One is we need to make sincere aspirations to find a teacher, and then we need to look as well. And when we look, we need to have an open mind. Because often people have a very sort of fixed idea of what the teacher should look like. And if they don't look like that, they discount everyone else. So actually your qualified teacher may be right in front of you, but you're discounting them because they don't look like this sort of stereotype image you have of what a teacher should look like, and you discount them. So have an open mind, sincere aspirations, and then look, and we will find. But when we're searching for a teacher, of course, we need to check out the teacher thoroughly before accepting them. And unfortunately, in the modern world, we see that is often not the case. That people jump in to accepting a person because maybe they seem very charismatic, maybe they've got lots of followers, and don't check them out. And then, as we often hear, and tragically, then what happens is the teacher's not qualified, and often they have very bad motivation, and then often people end up being in financial, psychological, or with sexual abuse from the teacher. And that happens a lot in the modern world. We do not want to end up in that situation. So we need to thoroughly check out the teacher before accepting them. And in the text, the old texts, they often said something like, you may need to check out the teacher for up to 12 years before accepting them. Because remember, in those days, maybe the teacher came to your village once a year for a week or a couple of days. So to thoroughly check them out, it may actually take up to 12 years. But of course, in the modern world, a little bit different with communication and so forth. But the bottom line is we need to thoroughly check them out before accepting them. Otherwise, we can end up in a very bad situation. Now, in terms of teachers, we saw there are 3 levels of practice. The foundation level, the Mahayana level, and the Vajrayana level. And at the foundation level of Four Noble Truths, the teacher is often called a Thera. Thera means an elder, someone who's more advanced in the spiritual practice, a spiritual elder who guides you on the path. At the Mahayana level of practice, the teacher is often called a Kalyana Mitra, a Sanskrit term, often translated into English as something like a virtuous spiritual friend. Kalyana Mitra in Tibetan is Geshe. Ge is short for Gewa meaning virtue, Shen is short for Shenyan meaning spiritual friend. Virtuous spiritual friend. What we need to realize, of course, in the modern world, this word Geshe is simply an academic title. That if a monk or a nun has studied for many years, typically up to 20 years of study, and have passed some academic exam, they are given the title Geshe. Whereas historically, it really meant a qualified teacher of Mahayana. So now, in these modern day, if you see someone called Geshe this, Geshe that, you should not automatically assume they're a qualified teacher of Mahayana. What you can assume is that they have some level of academic knowledge and have passed some exams. Whether or not they're a qualified teacher, we need to check them out. At the level of Tantra or Vajrayana, the teacher is called Guru. And Guru literally means someone heavy with qualities, meaning someone who has a lot of qualities at the level of Tantra or Vajrayana practice. The word Guru in Tibetan is Lama. But again, in the modern world, this word Lama, I think, is used much more liberally, loosely. So again, if you see someone called Lama this or Lama that, you should not assume automatically, therefore, they are a qualified teacher of Tantra or Vajrayana. You need to check them out. And similarly, we often see another term in Tibetan Buddhism, Rinpoche. Rinpoche means precious one. And a Rinpoche is someone who's been identified as, in their previous life, some high-level practitioner. And now they're called this because they're precious, because if they get the same conditions, they can be very much use to us. But what we need to realize, again, is that sometimes this system is abused. Because if a monastery or nunnery had a couple of Rinpoches, they would tend to get more money from the local community. So again, if we see someone called Rinpoche this, Rinpoche that, do not assume automatically they're a qualified teacher. Check them out. So, since in the LAMRIM here, the Geluk is part of Mahayana, what I'd like to do now is have a look at what qualities should we look for in a Kalyana Mitra, a qualified teacher of Mahayana. And the texts mention 10 qualities that we are to look for in a teacher. And since Mahayana is based on the foundation teachings of the Four Noble Truths, and the 3 core areas of practice there were ethics, concentration, wisdom, then of course, qualified teacher of Mahayana needs to be well practiced in those 3, of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. Particularly this wisdom here of no self. So they need to have a lot of experience in these 3 areas as a foundation. And then of course, if they are to be useful to us, they need to have greater knowledge than us. So they need to have greater knowledge than the student. But also, of course, in the Mahayana, as we've seen, there's a wide range of practices. And so if they're going to be helpful to us, they need to have understanding in a lot of different practices. Because if their own understanding is only in a very narrow bandwidth, and our needs fall outside of that, they're no use to us. So therefore they need to have what's called a wealth of scriptural knowledge, knowledge of many topics. And of course, here in the Mahayana, to overcome the mental afflictions and suffering, we need to realize emptiness. So the teacher needs to be able to guide us in this practice. So if they're going to guide us in this practice effectively, then they themselves needed to have realized emptiness. And of course, if they're going to be helpful to us, they need to put effort in helping us. Because if they're lazy, they're not much use to us. So they need to have diligence, they need to put effort in helping us. Sorry? Realized emptiness. So diligence, they need to put effort in helping us, otherwise they're no use to us. But even if they put effort in helping us, they need to be skilled in teaching. Because if they're not skilled in teaching, we maybe don't understand what they're saying. And even if they're skilled in teaching, they need to have a good motivation for helping us. Because if their motivation is that they want to be famous and get money and praise and so forth, they're no use to us. So their motivation to help us must be one of great compassion. But not only do they need great compassion, but sometimes we are a bit slow in understanding. So they also need to have great patience with us. So these are the 10 qualities that are often mentioned in the text in what we are to look for in a qualified teacher. Then you may think, well, it might be just a little bit difficult to find someone who has all of these qualities. And then the texts often go on to say, well, okay, then focus on the 5 main or most important of the 10. So what are the 5 core qualities we should look for in a teacher out of these 10? Well, of course, we need the basis. You know? Without the basis, then no chance. So what are the other 2?
Number 4.
9.
Well, they need to realise emptiness and great compassion, the 2 main wings of practice of wisdom and compassion. But even that might be difficult. So sometimes the text says, okay, as a rock bottom minimum, 3 qualities. And these 3 are not in this list. The first one is the teacher should have more qualities than faults. More qualities than faults. The second quality is they should be thinking more of future lives than this life. They should be thinking more of future lives than this life. What does that mean? It means, is this person caught up in the 8 worldly concerns? Are they trying to be famous, earn a lot of money, prestige? They should be thinking more of future lives than this life. What that really means, are they caught up in the 8 worldly concerns? Are they trying to be rich and famous and prestige and so forth? If they are, they're not a qualified teacher. And the third one is they should be thinking more of others than themselves. Thinking more of others than themselves. So if they're being very selfish, not a qualified teacher. But of course, if we want to find a qualified teacher, we need to be a qualified student. What does it mean to be a qualified student? And often here the text mentions three qualities. The first one is that we should be unbiased. And here unbiased means to not disparage or put down any other valid spiritual tradition.
Can you repeat?
To not put down or disparage any other valid tradition. So if we, for example, think that Buddhism is the best and every other spiritual tradition is inferior, we are not a qualified student of Buddhism. Which one is the best tradition? And there is an answer. Which is the best spiritual tradition?
Yours.
The one that works best for you. So maybe Buddhism is best for you, but for someone else it may be Christianity or some other tradition. So therefore, to respect all valid spiritual traditions if we want to be a qualified student of Buddhism. Second quality is wisdom. And here, the particular wisdom is what's called discerning wisdom. What this means is that we are not to blindly follow any instructions. That we need to evaluate any instructions we receive before implementing them. So if we are blindly following our teacher, we are not a qualified student of Buddhism. And if our teacher gives us advice that seems unethical, we must ask the teacher to explain why it's not unethical. And if they can't give us a satisfactory answer, we must under no circumstances follow those instructions. So that's the second one, wisdom. Third, is we need to put effort. And here we need to put effort in two things. Into study and practice. When I first came to Buddhism, I think I had maybe 1.5 out of 3. I definitely was not unbiased because I really felt Buddhism was the best and everything else was inferior. I think I never really blindly accepted anything. I checked things out. I put some effort into study. I put no effort into practice. Now I think I'm much more unbiased and I'm starting to put some effort into practice. So if we really want to be a qualified student of Buddhism, if we don't have these qualities, we need to cultivate them.
At any point when you're checking wisdom with your teacher, and the teacher has not been able to prove something to you and you don't believe them or something, would you ever change teachers?
Yeah. So of course we should never get to this situation, because if we do, the reason is we never didn't check them out properly first when we accepted them. So again, the emphasis, we do not want to get ourselves in a situation where we've accepted a teacher and then down the road we see that actually they're not qualified and actually they're trying to exploit us in either financially, psychologically or sexually. This we can avoid usually if we check them out thoroughly. But if we didn't and we got to this situation, then and we really see that they're really being very exploitive, we should just cut from that teacher and have nothing more to do with that teacher.
How do we protect others from a teacher like
and just I wanted to add one thing, and I'll come back. Sometimes, if the student is very capable and moves very quickly, it could be at some point they go past the level of the teacher. And if that happens, often what will happen at that time, the teacher will say, well, I can't be of any help to you anymore, but I recommend this teacher. So then that could happen as well.
Provided the teacher realizes that.
Well, if they're authentic teachers, they will realise that. So the question?
How do we protect other people from teachers who exploit?
Yeah. I think it's just awareness, it's like, and we see this fortunately starting to happen better now than, in the last years, it was not good. Because I think in the modern world, of course, people have got a lot of problems and they're desperate, and then they suddenly see this supposed wonderful teacher, guru, who's promising the world. Generally, if they're promising the world, we have to be very cautious. Very cautious, because usually there's a hidden agenda if they're promising a lot of things.
So telling others to really check out their qualifications.
Yeah. So again, if someone in public is saying how wonderful they are and they're promising all these things, we need to be super cautious. Because actually, one of the qualities that a teacher who's highly qualified has in huge amount is humility. Humility. So anyone who in public is boasting about their capacity and so forth, we need to be super careful, because high probability that they're not, and they're having some hidden agenda.
About the first one. So, if you find somebody who says something like Buddhism is correct and Catholic is wrong, or because of this thing, would you say this is not accomplishing the first one?
Yeah, of course, what we're saying is that we're talking about any valid spiritual tradition.
Right.
And I think we can see that if people are properly following Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, whatever, if they're properly following it, they receive benefit.
Right.
In all of them.
So, but the first one says that...
And so therefore, from our side, to respect that.
Right. So
if we just say, no, that Christianity, that's a load of rubbish, that's really bad.
But it's okay to say they are wrong and I'm right.
No, they're not wrong.
Okay.
Why are they wrong?
Because in the book, it says, in this book...
Right. So what you're going to say is that can Buddhism maybe take us further than some other traditions? Maybe.
Yeah.
But they're all going in the same direction.
Right.
So therefore, you wouldn't put down someone, if we're in university, we wouldn't put down someone in primary school and say they're inferior. Because they're going in the same direction. We respect that.
Okay.
Go on.
Okay, he says, some religions like Hinduism or Christianity talk of an eternal soul.
Sure.
They have no understanding
Sure.
of the characteristic nature of the soul.
Right.
So basically he's saying that they are wrong and I'm right.
No. What he's saying is they have a limited understanding. That they're still maybe from his perspective, there's still more to learn.
So he's not putting him above the others.
No. He's just saying that in those traditions, they don't have the same understanding as emptiness. But they're still helping people to move in a correct direction. Even in Buddhism, as we've seen, in the different philosophical systems, of course there's different levels of understanding. Some say there is a self, some say there's no self, some say there's no independent existence, no inherent existence. There are many, even within Buddhism, there are many levels of understanding of the nature of reality. And so to respect that and to understand these are all steps on the way to the goal of liberation. That's all. Okay. That's all I wanted to cover on relying on a teacher. Any last questions on that before we move to the next topic?
You have practical advice for people that how to start?
Okay. So of course, first, point in terms of looking for a teacher is, first, we need to find a tradition that resonates with us. There's no point in finding a qualified teacher in a tradition that we don't connect with, because they're going to give us instructions according to that tradition. So then it's not going to work for us. So the first step, of course, is to find a tradition. And I'm assuming that we're interested in following some sort of Buddhist tradition. And if we're not even that far, then we need to look at a broader thing in what sort of spiritual path sort of suits me. And if we've sort of narrowed it down and say, okay, I think one of the Buddhist traditions is what suits me, then within that, and there's many of them, is find one that sort of resonates with us, because they often have very different approaches to practice. And for some people, this tradition is really suitable. For others, it's another one. So find a tradition that really resonates with us. And then make sure that we start to work within that tradition so it's not just an intellectual idea, yes, I'd like to do that. Because often people hear a few words and they go, oh yeah, I'd like to do that Zen thing, it sounds really cool. And then they go and look for a Zen teacher, and then they find a Zen teacher and he gives them instructions and they go, oh, I don't want to do that. Because we just picked Zen because it sounded fine or whatever, a friend told us. So what we need to do is really start to immerse ourselves in that tradition by listening to some teachings, reflecting on them, starting to meditate, so that we get to a point where we really feel, okay, yes, this is really what I want to do. Because we need to have that confidence that this is what I want to follow. Because there's no point in going to a teacher if we're not at that stage, because we're just wasting their time. So if we really have gone into a tradition and we feel really this is the one I want to follow, then we can look for a teacher. And what I would recommend is that when we look for a teacher in a tradition, that often if that teacher is part of a bigger organisation, that's going to be a little bit easier. Sometimes teachers sort of branch out on their own and do their own thing, and sometimes that's most effective for them. But for those sorts of teachers, we need to check them out even more thoroughly. Because these ones sometimes are the ones that are doing their own thing because there's no scrutiny. They can do whatever they want. Because there's no organisation sort of looking out for what they're doing. So if they're a teacher who's sort of not part of a bigger organisation, we need to even check them out even more thoroughly.
What do you mean by organization?
Well, there's big organisations, like this is part of FPMT. I'm not saying if they're part of an organisation, then tick, they're fine. What I'm saying is that if they're not part of an organisation, we need to scrutinise even more, because organisation often has some form of vetting and checking and so forth. Whereas if they're on their own, they can just start up whatever they want. But some really qualified teachers do that because they find themselves most effective in that way. But either way, we need to check them out thoroughly.
Is there any gender restriction?
No. In fact, that's what I was saying, is that we need to be open-minded. Because often, sometimes, when we talk about guru, we think it must be some elder male who's a monk. If they're not that, they're not qualified. I mean, this would be a completely wrong way of thinking.
I think that goes with my question about how, because when we think about this teacher, right, I think I have a teacher, I'm not 100% sure, but I have the Venerable that starts teaching Buddhism to me.
Sure.
So she teaches Buddhism in that monastery close to my home, and we meet like 3 times a year maybe. She gives me texts, I study, we have our meetings. For me, that is a teacher, but I'm not sure if I should be looking for something more than that.
Right. So there's sort of and we can have a teacher that we go to and get teachings and stuff. But sort of the line there is that, are we really entrusting ourselves to them in terms of their advice, personal advice? And from our side, if we want to go from the point of just going to their teachings in general, which is great because we get inspiration and we get a lot of... If we want to go to that next step of asking for personal advice, then I would recommend that if we're not prepared to follow what they tell us, don't ask. I mean, otherwise it's just a game. Because then what will happen is they'll give us some advice, and maybe it's going to be difficult and go, oh no, I don't want to do that. But then the whole student-teacher relationship is broken, and then we're not going to benefit. Because often, like I said, the very thing they're going to get you to do is the one thing that you find difficult because it's the one thing you really need to work on. But if you don't have that trust and confidence in the teacher established, and then they ask you to do something difficult, you go, oh no, I'm not going to do that. So, again, if we really want to have personal teacher, my advice is if we're not willing to follow their advice, don't ask. Of course, if their advice is unethical, then we must not follow. But if we're just sort of like cherry picking, we're going to the teacher, and if they tell us something nice, we'll do it, but if not, I won't do it, better don't ask at all.
How much is it, like, what is the compensation between teachers and...
Compensation. Good point. Very important point. If a teacher is asking for money for personal advice, my own feeling is that's not okay at all, ever. Does a teacher sometimes ask for money to support their activities and they're in a centre? Yeah, centres have running costs and so forth. But if you are going to the teacher for personal advice and they're asking for money, for me that's never okay. In fact, historically, if a teacher took on a student as a student of theirs, they also took on financial responsibility for the student. That's how it worked historically. They would look out for the financial needs of the student as well.
Then how would the Guru support them themselves?
Because the students or the community see the value and they just offer. They just offer. That is the system. We see that in the countries, is that the community and the students understand and realise the benefit, and they will just, as part of that, they will just, from their own side, they'll just offer either money or help or support in whatever way they can. But for the teacher, from their side, to demand money for personal instruction, for me, that is not okay. Not okay.
So this conversation is bringing about a lot of kind of famous and people out there that are trying to get their message across, like famous gurus, and I think Tony Robbins and like Jay Shetty as examples. Jay Shetty, who lived as a monk for 3 years and he's now like the 5th richest in the world or something. But his teachings do help people.
Correct.
And like, but obviously he's like getting loads of money for it. So what would the Buddhist view on that be?
Well, having a lot of money is not a problem, but what is he doing with that money? I mean, is he just living in big palatial homes and driving fancy cars, or is he using that money to help others in the world? Because we see some gurus who get a lot of money, but then they build hospitals, they help others, they do a lot. That's fantastic. If you have more money, you can benefit more. But if they're just gathering money to live in a big palatial home and fly around in private jets and so forth, I think that's not okay. I mean, no. I mean, it's not really sending a good message, is it?
No. What about the regularity? How often would you visit?
Yeah. So how would you visit? I mean, again, what would happen is that you'd go and say, can you give me some advice on what I should do? And they'd give you a list of things to do. And then they'd often say, okay, go away and do that for a month or 3 months. Come back and tell me what happened. So often that would be the case. And in between, if some difficulty comes up, now of course you can write an email and say, well, I'm trying to implement these instructions, but this and this is coming up, what should I do? And then you maybe get some interim advice. But then, 3 months later you go back and say, okay, I did use instructions, what you asked, this is what happened, what should I do next?
Could you talk a little bit more about the sexual abuse?
I mean, it's just horrendous. It's horrendous. That's why we really need to, it's psychological, financial, it's horrendous. And because, people have mental afflictions and they see that they can, and they just take advantage of that. Because, see, the thing is that in spiritual traditions, it's often said, like in Buddhism, often we say, see the guru like a Buddha. But then people misconstrue that. And they think that, okay, they're a Buddha, so whatever they do is fine. This is not what seeing your guru as a Buddha means. But that's what people... and of course, in that same vein, it's said that we should follow the guru's advice. Yes, we should. But then people misconstrue that as, whatever they tell me, I've got to do that. And that's tragic. But that's a complete lack of discerning wisdom. And that, I think, is the key, is from our side, is to really have that discerning wisdom. And we can avoid going down that path. And unfortunately, people don't do that, and they end up in a lot of trouble, as we see. It's tragic. Tragic.
How to find a teacher in our area?
No. Again, the teacher doesn't really even have to live in our area, but it would be helpful if we could see them personally at least a few times a year. So if they're coming through a couple of times a year, or we have the financial ability to go and see them in other places or in other countries, and for many of us that's possible, because often if it's some very highly regarded teacher, they're probably zipping around the planet quite a lot. But if we have the financial means, and of course often they have then retreats in certain place, so then you go to that place, and then you can see them there, and then you go back home. So, and for many of us that's possible, and so then they don't even need to be living in the same country as us. But I think realistically, if you need to be able to have a face one-on-one at least 2 or 3 times a year, I think. If less than that, might be a bit difficult.
Does it have to be one?
Doesn't have to be one, but we said that if we have more than one personal teacher, then can be difficult. Because if we have 2 personal teachers and they give us what seems to be contradictory advice, what do we do? What do we do? Teacher A says do this, teacher B says do that, and it seems to be not completely opposite. Then we get confused. And generally, if we go to a teacher for personal advice and we tell them we've already received personal advice from another teacher, they'll most often say, follow those instructions.
How strong should be the devotion to your teacher? Because I've seen people leaving their families, living their normal life to kind of serve the teacher for their life. Is it normal?
Yes, but again, devotion doesn't mean blind faith. It doesn't mean throw discerning wisdom out the window. So if you're going to abandon your family, particularly if you're the support for them, that's completely not okay. That's completely not okay to do that. That would be a complete lack of discerning wisdom, to abandon the family to do that.
So why does it happen? Because I've seen people in ashrams or something, they literally devote their lives. They don't
devoting your life is fine, but if they have a spouse and children that are dependent on them and they abandon them, that is completely not okay. But I think often these people don't have that situation. They're probably single, and so they don't have anyone dependent on them. And then if they want to go off and devote themselves, that's fine. But again, devote doesn't mean just follow like a sheep. No. Again, the role of the guru is to make themselves out of a job. The role of the guru is to awaken the inner guru in you. So over time, you should be becoming less and less dependent on the guru. Okay. Last question, then the break.
Do you think it's a problem if your family or husband or wife is following a completely different tradition?
No. But if you are trying to follow a spiritual path, meaning developing your inner qualities and values and so forth, and your partner is completely caught up in making lots of money and pleasure and that, then I suggest it might be a bit difficult. But I think probably if that's the case, you won't have much in common. But certainly, do you need to both be Buddhist? No. In fact, I know many people who are Buddhist who their partner is Christian or some other, or maybe not even religious at all, but they both share values in terms of developing inner qualities, of developing love and compassion and helping people and so forth. So that, I think, is the main thing. So let's break there, take a break, and then we'll move on to the next topic at 10:45.